Before Israel crossed the Jordan, one king came down from the northern highlands to stop them. His name was Og. He ruled a country of black stone fortresses, commanded 60 fortified cities, and belonged to a people the Bible remembers as the Rephaim. Centuries later, an iron bed connected with his name was still being shown in a foreign city. It was roughly 4 meters long. Yet the strangest detail comes before the battle. God looked at Moses, the man who had faced Pharaoh, the Red Sea, and the armies of Egypt, and said, "Do not fear him." Why would Moses need to hear that about this king? Og is one of the most visually powerful figures in the Old Testament and one of the easiest to exaggerate. The biblical text gives us a formidable ruler, a vast kingdom, a mysterious connection to the Rephaim, and the dimensions of an enormous iron object. Later tradition adds something far more spectacular: a giant who survived the flood, lived for centuries, tore a mountain from the earth, and tried to crush the entire camp of Israel beneath it. Those later stories are fascinating, but they are not the same thing as the account in Numbers and Deuteronomy. Tonight we will keep the layers separate. What does the Bible actually say about Og? Was he truly a giant, and if so, how tall was he? What was the iron bed in Rabbah? Why did his kingdom contain 60 fortified cities? Why did God tell Moses not to fear him? And how did a short biblical battle grow into one of the wildest giant legends in Jewish tradition? The story begins after Israel has already defeated another Amorite king. Sihon refused to let the people pass through his territory. He gathered his army, marched into the wilderness, and lost his kingdom. Israel then moved north toward Bashan, a region very different from the endless sand many biblical films imagine. Bashan was a high, fertile country of dark volcanic stone, oak forests, rich pasture, cold mist, and fortified cities. Mount Hermon rose beyond it. This was a land of abundance, strength, and natural defenses. Then Og came out to meet Israel at Edrei. The text does not show him hiding behind his walls. It shows the king, his people, and his army advancing toward the same nation that had just defeated Sihon. Og appears confident enough to choose the battlefield himself. That is when God speaks to Moses, "Do not fear him, for I have given him and all his people and his land into your hand." The command is brief, but it creates a question the passage never directly answers. Was Moses actually afraid? Was Israel afraid? Was God anticipating fear before it appeared? Or was this the familiar language of divine reassurance before an impossible conflict? The Bible does not say. Any explanation must remain an inference. But the details that follow show why Og could inspire fear. Deuteronomy describes his territory as a kingdom of 60 cities. These were not open villages. The text emphasizes high walls, gates, and bars, along with many unwalled settlements. A later reader might imagine one legendary giant standing alone. The biblical picture is more serious. Og possessed an organized kingdom: population, agriculture, roads, strongholds, military forces, and layers of defense spread across Bashan. Joshua remembers him as king of Bashan, living at Ashtaroth and Edrei, ruling from Mount Hermon toward Salika and the borders of neighboring territories. His power was geographic, not merely physical. Even if Og had been an ordinary-sized man, the ruler of this landscape would have been a formidable enemy. The number 60 also deserves care. The passage calls the wider district Argob and says there was not a city that Israel failed to take from Og's kingdom. It does not mean every settlement was identical or that 60 towers stood in one line. It describes a network of defended communities spread through a strategic highland. A traveler moving through Bashan would encounter dark walls rising above green slopes, roads controlled by gates, and strongholds able to warn one another. The king at the center of that network possessed depth. Defeating one outpost would not end the war. Ancient ruins across the region confirm that basalt could shape an imposing built environment, but archaeology has not uncovered a plaque reading "The Palace of Og." Biblical place names, later settlements, and excavated walls help reconstruct the landscape. They do not give us a photograph of this particular king. The film can make Bashan tangible without pretending that every fortress on screen has been identified. But Deuteronomy adds one sentence that transformed him into a legend. Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Some Bible translations render Rephaim as giants. Others keep the ancient name. The term appears in several settings across the Old Testament, and not every occurrence is identical. In historical narratives, the Rephaim are remembered as an ancient people associated with exceptional size and strength. In poetic texts, a similar word can refer to shades of the dead. The safest conclusion here is that Deuteronomy links Og to a feared ancient population. It does not call him a Nephilim, and it never says he descended from the sons of God in Genesis 6. Deuteronomy itself places the Rephaim beside other memories of unusually imposing peoples. The Moabites called one group Emim. The Ammonites used the name Zamzummim. The Anakim became the standard comparison for great height in the spies report. The chapter is looking backward across layers of population and conquest. Og is presented as the surviving royal representative of that older landscape, not as the only tall person who ever lived. This is one reason the phrase, "last giant king," works as a title but needs explanation. It is a concise translation of the impression created by the passage, a king left from the remnant of the Rephaim. It is not a claim that no large warrior appeared later. Goliath and other formidable fighters do appear in the biblical story. Og is last within this notice about the surviving Rephaim kingdom, not necessarily the final unusually tall human being in all history. That distinction matters. Modern retellings often merge Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zamzummim, and every unusually tall warrior into one bloodline. The Bible sometimes connects these groups and sometimes distinguishes them. It gives fragments of memory, not a complete biological chart. Og belongs to the Rephaim in the text. Calling him a Nephilim goes beyond what the passage says. The next clue is the object that survived him. Deuteronomy asks whether Og's iron bed was still in Rabbah of the Ammonites. Its measurements were 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, according to the ordinary cubit. Depending on the cubit used, that is roughly 4 meters by nearly 2 meters, about 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide. Why preserve those dimensions? The obvious answer is that the object displayed Og's extraordinary scale. A bed that large would make every visitor imagine the man who used it. It functioned like a physical witness. The king was gone, but the object associated with him remained. The location is curious. Rabbah belonged to the Ammonites, not to Og's captured kingdom. How did the object get there? The text does not explain. It may have been carried as a trophy, inherited through regional politics, preserved because it was already famous, or known by a traditional association with Og. Each possibility creates a story, but none is stated. What matters to the writer is that contemporary hearers could apparently be directed towards something they recognized. Is it not in Rabbah? Yet the Hebrew word can describe a bed or couch, and scholars have proposed other possibilities. It may have been a royal resting couch, a ceremonial platform, a funerary couch, or even a sarcophagus-like monument. Iron may describe the material itself, iron ornamentation, or a dark basalt object remembered as iron. No excavated artifact has been securely identified as Og's bed. Most importantly, the size of a bed is not automatically the exact height of its owner. Kings use oversized monuments. A warrior may sleep on a frame longer than his body. A funerary object may magnify status. The verse strongly communicates unusual scale and memory, but it does not provide a medical measurement of Og from head to foot. The use of iron heightens the impression. In a world remembered through stone, wood, and bronze, an iron object sounded durable, costly, and difficult to ignore. Some interpreters have wondered whether the word referred to dark basalt, a material abundant in the region, but the normal reading remains iron. Even then, it need not mean every part of the structure was solid metal. A frame could be reinforced, plated, or decorated. The text gives the material and dimensions, not an engineering diagram. So how tall was he? Scripture never tells us. For cinematic reconstruction, artists must choose a height, face, clothing, and body. Those choices can make the story visible, but they are not recovered facts. Og can reasonably be portrayed as towering over ordinary soldiers because the text associates him with the Rephaim and an enormous bed. What cannot be claimed is that the Bible gives a precise number for his height, gray skin, monstrous features, horns, or supernatural powers. It gives none of those details. Another prophetic image is sometimes brought into the discussion. Amos describes the Amorite as tall as cedars and strong as oaks. Og was an Amorite king, so the language fits the atmosphere of his world. But Amos does not name Og, and poetic comparison is not a tape measure. It communicates intimidating power, not an exact anatomy. Return now to Edrei. Israel is approaching a country covered with fortresses. Og is linked to an ancient race remembered for size. His own massive object is preserved as a curiosity, and his army comes out rather than waiting behind its walls. In that context, "Do not fear him" no longer sounds like an unnecessary sentence. The king embodies every reason a wandering nation might turn back. There may be another layer. Moses had already encountered stories about giants. Years earlier, the spies returned from Canaan describing enormous inhabitants and saying that Israel looked like grasshoppers beside them. That report spread terror through the camp. The result was a generation condemned to wander rather than enter the land. Og now stands at the end of those wilderness years like a final test of the old fear. The contrast is sharper because Israel's earlier defeat was psychological before it was military. The frightened spies did not lose a battle to giants. They persuaded the community not to begin one. Fear converted a report into rebellion. At Bashan, the report has become visible. There is a real king, a real army, real walls, and a name tied to the Rephaim. The new generation must decide whether sight will again outweigh promise. The Bible does not explicitly say Moses remembered the spies when he saw Og, but the narrative pattern is hard to miss. The first generation heard about giants and refused to advance. The new generation reaches the kingdom of a Rephaim king, hears God say not to fear, and continues forward. Og is more than a large opponent. He represents the terror that once stopped an entire nation. Later Jewish interpreters asked the same question. Why would Moses fear Og after everything Moses had witnessed? Their answer created a second Og, much older and stranger than the biblical king. One rabbinic tradition says Og had survived from the generation of the flood. Other retellings place him outside Noah's ark or clinging near it while the waters rose. Some connect him with the fallen watchers through a legendary genealogy. These stories attempt to explain how one giant could remain as the last remnant of an ancient world. But Genesis does not place Og at the ark. It names no giant survivor outside Noah's family. Numbers and Deuteronomy never say Og lived before the flood. This is later sacred storytelling, not a missing verse from Genesis. The tradition then explains Moses' fear through memory and merit. Og, it says, had once brought news to Abraham concerning Lot. Moses feared that an ancient act of service might protect him. The idea is theological. Even a dangerous enemy may possess one remembered deed, and Moses does not presume to know how God will judge it. Again, this explanation comes from later rabbinic discussion. The biblical narrative itself gives no reason for the command not to fear. The most spectacular legend appears in the Talmud. Og sees the camp of Israel and uproots a mountain large enough to cover it. He carries the mountain above his head, intending to drop it upon the people. Then the mountain becomes trapped around him, and Moses strikes him. The story describes impossible proportions because it is not trying to function as ordinary battlefield reporting. It turns Og into the physical shape of overwhelming danger and Moses into the small servant through whom God defeats it. Later storytelling also enlarges Moses for the encounter, giving him extraordinary height, an enormous weapon, and an impossible leap. The proportions are part of the teaching. The legend does not merely ask who was taller. It repeatedly magnifies Og and then shows that even the largest imaginable enemy can be defeated through a servant who acts under God's command. Reading the scene as later interpretation lets its meaning survive without confusing it with the sparse report in Numbers. That scene can be powerful as symbolic tradition. It becomes misleading only when presented as though Numbers records a mountain attack. It does not. The biblical battle is remarkably restrained. Numbers says Israel struck Og, his sons, and all his people until no survivor remained, and they possessed his land. Deuteronomy recalls the same victory and the capture of the cities. No duel is narrated. No weapon of Og is described. No account tells us who physically faced him or how he fell. The text focuses on the reversal. The king who came out to stop Israel lost the land he ruled. We can tell that reversal without celebrating suffering. The gates open. The army marches. The field disappears into mist and distance. Then the roads of Bashan become silent, abandoned shields lie beneath black walls, and the kingdom changes hands. Scripture records a total ancient war, a reality modern readers may find deeply uncomfortable. A responsible film should neither erase the severity of the text nor turn it into graphic spectacle. The territory was then assigned east of the Jordan. Bashan, the domain of Og, became part of Israel's inheritance. The 60 cities that had symbolized an impossible obstacle became evidence that the obstacle had been overcome. The strongest defenses in the region could not preserve a kingdom God had judged. Og's name did not disappear. Psalms written for worship later place Sion and Og beside the great kings defeated by God. Psalm 136 repeats the memory inside its refrain of enduring mercy. Sion king of the Amorites and Og king of Bashan, whose land was given as a heritage. To modern ears, mercy and battlefield judgment may sit uneasily together. In the psalm, the mercy is experienced by the people delivered from kings who stood between them and the promised land. That liturgical memory tells us how large Og remained in Israel's imagination. He was not forgotten as a minor border ruler. His defeat became shorthand for a victory no human calculation could guarantee. Later biblical speakers could say, "Remember what happened to Sion and Og," and the audience understood the argument. The threat in front of you is not greater than the threat already overcome. What, then, can we say with confidence? Og was a king of Bashan whose power extended across a highly fortified northern territory. The Bible associates him with the remaining Rephaim. It preserves the extraordinary dimensions of a bed, couch, or monument connected with him. It records that God told Moses not to fear him and that Israel defeated his kingdom at Edrei. These are the textual foundations. The Bible does not give Og's exact height. It does not call him a Nephilim. It does not say he survived the flood. It does not describe him uprooting a mountain. It does not narrate a personal duel between Og and Moses. Those images belong to reconstruction and later tradition. And yet the historical core is dramatic enough without the additions. At the edge of the promised land stood a king whose name carried the memory of an older, larger people. Behind him were 60 fortified cities built from the dark stone of Bashan. Before him stood a nation that had once fled from the mere report of giants. Between them came one command: do not fear him. Perhaps this is the true reason Og endured in Scripture. His physical size is the question everyone asks, but fear is the question the story answers. The text never measures the king. It measures the difference between what Israel saw and what God promised. The iron bed remained in Rabbah. The fortresses remained across the highlands. The stories grew until Og became older than the flood and large enough to lift a mountain. But the biblical account keeps returning to a smaller sentence. Do not fear him. The last giant king did not become memorable because the Bible tells us exactly how tall he stood. He became memorable because everything around him looked too large to overcome: his ancestry, his army, his walls, his cities, and the shadow of an earlier generation's terror. Then Bashan fell silent, and the road toward the Jordan remained open. So where do you draw the line? Does the iron bed prove that Og himself was a literal giant, or was it a royal monument meant to magnify his memory? And when later tradition places him at the flood and beneath an uprooted mountain, does it preserve an ancient memory, or transform a powerful king into a symbol larger than history?